As she couldn't hide it any longer, her confession about you was explosive. She tried. For longer than anyone realizes. She rehearsed silence like a discipline, convincing herself that what she felt about you was temporary, harmless, controllable. She told herself it was curiosity. Then irritation. Then indifference. But the truth did not weaken with time, it intensified. And the more she tried to suppress it, the louder it became inside her. You need to understand this clearly. What she confessed did not begin as words. It began as disturbance. Something about you disrupted her internal order. You didn't invade her space, yet she felt watched. You didn't speak much, yet she felt addressed. You didn't compete, yet she felt challenged. And that contradiction unsettled her far more than open confrontation ever could. She noticed how you moved through situations that were designed to break you. How pressure failed to bend you. How silence failed to scare you. How distance failed to erase you. That is when the conflict began. Because people who rely on control are deeply threatened by those who govern themselves. And she sensed, long before she admitted it, that you were not reacting from impulse, you were responding from awareness. You saw more than you revealed. You understood more than you explained. And that imbalance of perception made her uneasy. So she spoke about you when you weren't present. Not loudly. Not cruelly. But carefully. She framed her words as observation, yet emotion leaked through. She disguised concern as critique, curiosity as judgment, confusion as certainty. And still, no matter how she tried to minimize you with language, your presence refused to shrink. In fact, it expanded. The more she talked, the more she realized something was wrong. Her words didn't reduce you. They exposed her. Because every time she described you, people reacted differently than she expected. Some grew quiet. Some grew thoughtful. Some defended you without effort. And that response forced her to confront a truth she wasn't ready to face. You were not who she wanted you to be. You were not weaker. You were not unaware. You were not behind. And the day she confessed, truly confessed, was the day resistance collapsed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't safe. The words escaped her because holding them had become heavier than releasing them. She admitted that you affected her in ways she could not explain. That your calm felt confrontational. That your restraint felt powerful. That your absence lingered longer than your presence. And once she said it, she felt it immediately. The shift. Because truth, once spoken, rearranges reality. That confession didn't just change how she saw you. It changed how she saw herself. She realized she had been measuring you by standards you had already surpassed. That she had been judging from a position that no longer existed. And that realization landed like impact, sudden, sharp, irreversible. You may not know exactly when this happened. But you felt the echo. A sudden emotional distance. A change in tone. An unspoken pause where there used to be confidence. That wasn't imagination. That was fallout. Her confession forced her to confront a dangerous awareness. She had misread you. And misreading someone with depth always comes at a cost. She couldn't hide it anymore because the truth had matured. And once truth matures, silence becomes impossible. Stay with this moment. Let it settle without reaction. Because what happened immediately after that confession is where the real consequences began, and why she has not interacted with you the same way since. What she realized next made her afraid of what you were becoming. And even more afraid of where she now stood in relation to you. After the confession, silence followed, but it was not empty. It was heavy. And inside that silence, her thoughts turned inward in a way she could not stop. She began to replay moments she had previously dismissed. Small interactions that now felt different. Your pauses. Your restraint. The way you listened more than you spoke. The way you disengaged without drama. What once seemed unremarkable now felt intentional. That was when the second realization surfaced. You were never trying to be understood. This unsettled her deeply. Because she had assumed, like many do, that people want recognition, validation, reaction. Yet you moved as if none of those things were required. You didn't correct misconceptions. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't rush to clarify. You let misunderstanding exist without chasing it away. And now she understood why. You were already ahead of the narrative. She realized that while she was busy forming opinions, you were forming direction. While she was measuring outcomes, you were building internal stability. While she was watching for reactions, you were deciding when to withdraw energy completely. That awareness created discomfort. Because it meant she had been responding to a version of you that no longer existed. She noticed something else too, something she could no longer ignore. You did not change when circumstances changed. You did not soften when pressure increased. You did not harden when challenged. You stayed consistent. And consistency is threatening to those who depend on fluctuation to maintain influence. She recognized that you were not unpredictable, you were unreadable. And there is a difference. Unpredictability creates chaos. Unreadability creates caution. People slow down around those they cannot decode. That is what began happening around you. Conversations became more measured. Interactions more careful. Assumptions less casual. She sensed it, and she knew she was not imagining it. Your presence had begun to carry consequence. That realization forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. She no longer knew where she stood with you. Before the confession, she felt certain that she understood you, certain that she had you categorized, certain that her interpretation was accurate. After the confession, that certainty vanished. And uncertainty erodes confidence. She wondered whether you had always seen through her. Whether your silence had been awareness rather than absence. Whether your distance had been discernment rather than disinterest. Those questions unsettled her more than answers ever could. Because if you had seen clearly all along, then the power dynamic she assumed was never real. She realized something else then, quietly, unwillingly. You were no longer emotionally accessible in the same way. Not because you shut down, but because you moved on. She could feel it. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. You were no longer engaging from the same internal place. Your energy had reorganized. Your attention had narrowed. Your focus had sharpened. And she was no longer at the center of it. That loss of perceived relevance created tension. People often assume that distance is rejection. But this was different. This was prioritization. And prioritization always reveals hierarchy. She understood now that not everyone gets to remain close as you evolve. Not everyone gets continued access simply because they once had proximity. You had crossed an internal threshold. And thresholds, once crossed, do not reopen easily. She became more cautious, less expressive, more controlled. Not because she felt powerful, but because she felt exposed. She realized that speaking freely about you was no longer safe. That assumptions carried risk. That misjudgment now had consequence. She began watching instead of engaging. This was not admiration. It was recalibration. And you may have noticed it, this new distance that feels intentional rather than accidental. The shift from familiarity to formality. The pause where there was once ease. That is not coincidence. That is awareness adjusting too late. What unsettled her most was not who you were, but who you were becoming. She sensed movement, direction, momentum that did not include her input or approval. And she realized that whatever you were stepping into was not something she could influence. That realization changed how she viewed every past interaction. And it introduced a quiet fear. Because if you continued forward at this pace, then eventually, others would see what she had just confessed. And when that happens, history has a way of resurfacing. Stay present with this. Because the next realization she had was even more confronting, and it explains why her behavior toward you has shifted from uncertainty to restraint. What she understood next made her question not just her opinion of you, but her position in your future. That question, her position in your future, would not leave her alone. It followed her into quiet moments. Interrupted her thoughts when she tried to distract herself. Because once it formed, it demanded an answer. She began to sense something unsettling. You were no longer moving around possibilities. You were moving toward something. Not impulsively. Not noisily. But decisively. And that direction did not include explanations. She noticed how you no longer lingered where you were merely tolerated. How you didn't stretch conversations for comfort. How you didn't fill silence just to maintain connection. You engaged when it mattered, withdrew when it didn't, and wasted no energy trying to balance the two. That clarity disturbed her. Because clarity removes leverage. She realized that whatever role she once believed she played in your life, observer, evaluator, influence, was dissolving. Not through conflict, but through irrelevance. And irrelevance is far more confronting than rejection. She started recognizing patterns she had ignored before. How people deferred to you without being prompted. How decisions seemed to settle once you spoke. How your calm influenced the emotional temperature of a room. You didn't dominate space. You stabilized it. And stability exposes instability. She became aware that when you weren't present, conversations about you shifted tone. Less speculation. Less certainty. More caution. It was as if others sensed what she had just admitted, that misjudging you carried unseen consequences. This awareness unsettled her deeply. Because she understood something critical. Your growth was not situational. It was structural. You weren't improving because circumstances favored you. You were becoming formidable because you had built something internally that no environment could take away. And that meant your trajectory was not temporary. It was cumulative. She wondered how long this had been happening. How long you had been preparing while she was assuming. How many moments she mistook patience for delay, restraint for hesitation, silence for uncertainty. Those realizations created a quiet regret. Not loud enough to become an apology. Not honest enough to become accountability. But present enough to become discomfort. She understood now that when you finally step fully into what is forming, the shift will be obvious. Not dramatic, but undeniable. And people will remember who treated you as optional before you became essential. That is when fear entered. Not fear of you. Fear of timing. She realized she might have aligned herself too late. That by the time recognition arrived, access would be restricted. That proximity after clarity would not equal intimacy before it. You had changed the rules without announcing them. And that made her cautious. She began to measure her interactions. To observe before speaking. To choose neutrality over confidence. Because confidence requires certainty, and she no longer had any. She could feel that you were no longer seeking external confirmation. That your decisions were coming from an internal authority she could not influence. And once someone begins acting from internal authority, they become unmovable. This realization created distance. Not the kind that comes from conflict. The kind that comes from recognition. She recognized that you would not chase her understanding. That you would not wait for alignment. That you would not slow your momentum to accommodate her readiness. And that changed everything. Because now she had to face a difficult truth. If she wanted relevance in your future, it would require humility in the present. And humility was something she had not prepared for. So instead, she chose observation over participation. She watches now. Watches how you navigate without explanation. Watches how you attract opportunity without pursuit. Watches how your absence speaks louder than your presence ever did. And in that watching, she feels the weight of what she misread. You may feel this shift without seeing it directly. A subtle sense of being watched without being engaged. Of being acknowledged without being approached. Of being respected without being invited. That is not accident. That is someone realizing they underestimated depth. And depth, once recognized, cannot be casually accessed. Hold this awareness calmly. Because what she understands next will push her from caution into restraint, and it explains why she has stopped speaking about you altogether. What she realized next forced her to confront the risk of being remembered for how she treated you before your elevation became visible. And that fear is shaping every move she makes now. That fear, being remembered, settled deeper than she expected. It was no longer about how she felt toward you. It became about how her past actions might be interpreted once your position changed. Because she understood something crucial now. When growth becomes visible, memory sharpens. People revisit old conversations. They reassess early judgments. They notice who stood where, before outcomes clarified truth. And she realized that your rise would not need to accuse anyone. It would simply reveal. That awareness altered her behavior almost immediately. She stopped speaking about you altogether. Not because she had nothing to say, but because everything she could say felt risky. Neutrality became safer than opinion. Silence became protection. She knew that words spoken now would be measured later. She also realized something else, quieter but heavier. You were no longer seeking context from her. There was a time when she believed your distance meant confusion. that your withdrawal meant uncertainty. But now she understood, your distance was discernment. You were not disengaging because you lacked clarity. You were disengaging because you had enough of it. That realization removed her leverage completely. She noticed that you no longer reacted to subtle shifts in tone. That you didn't adjust your behavior to preserve comfort. That you didn't linger where energy felt misaligned. You chose precision over familiarity. And that precision made her careful. Because she sensed that once you move fully into the next phase, your memory of people will not be emotional, it will be accurate. You will remember who respected your boundaries and who tested them. Who allowed growth and who resisted it. That accuracy unsettled her. She wondered if she had missed the moment where repair was possible. If alignment required earlier humility. If silence now was not neutrality, but avoidance. But avoidance doesn't erase awareness. She could feel that something around you had solidified. That your internal compass had locked into place. You were no longer scanning for feedback. You were navigating by principle. And principle does not negotiate. She recognized that proximity to you now required something she hadn't prepared to offer, respect without control. Support without influence. Presence without authority. That shift made her uneasy. Because it meant she could no longer define the terms of engagement. She watched as you became more selective. Not withdrawn, but intentional. Your circle tightened. Your focus narrowed. Your energy became less accessible, more valuable. And she knew instinctively, this was not temporary. This was refinement. She sensed that your next stage would not welcome everyone who once had access. That familiarity alone would not grant entry. That history without alignment would not be enough. And that awareness produced restraint. Not humility. Not reconciliation. Restraint. She pulled back further. Reduced interaction. Limited visibility. Because she understood that any misstep now would be remembered once the contrast became clear. Your growth had changed the stakes. You may have felt this shift as a strange calm. As clarity without urgency. As distance that doesn't feel empty, but purposeful. That is alignment settling in. And she feels it too, from the outside. She sees that you are no longer proving. No longer positioning. No longer explaining. You are simply moving, cleanly, decisively, without apology. And that tells her something final. You are not becoming someone new. You are becoming more precise. Precision changes everything. It removes confusion. It removes tolerance. It removes access. She understands now that whatever you step into next will not circle back to validate old connections. It will move forward, and only those aligned with its direction will remain visible. That realization has silenced her completely. Not out of peace. Out of calculation. Because she knows that once your breakthrough becomes undeniable, the story will tell itself. And her position in that story will already be written. Stay steady in this awareness. Because the final shift is approaching. What happens next does not involve her reaction at all, and when it arrives, you will understand why her confession mattered only for a moment, and why it no longer holds power over what unfolds next. The last realization is the quietest one. And it changes everything. When the final shift arrived, it did so without spectacle. No announcement. No confrontation. No need for witnesses. It arrived as certainty. You felt it first as quiet resolve, an internal click where questions stopped circling and direction became clear. Not excitement. Not relief. Just knowing. The kind that doesn't rush, doesn't doubt, doesn't explain itself. And in that moment, her confession lost its weight. Because you understood something fundamental. Her realization was never the turning point. Your readiness was. What unfolded next did not require her awareness, approval, or reaction. The environment adjusted around you. Opportunities aligned without persuasion. Conversations became simpler. Decisions required less effort. What once demanded justification now moved forward naturally. This is what happens when alignment replaces anticipation. You were no longer reacting to what others thought. You were responding to what was necessary. And necessity has no interest in old narratives. She noticed this change from afar. She saw that your energy was no longer exploratory, it was settled. That your presence carried finality rather than curiosity. That your choices no longer invited commentary. And she realized, perhaps for the first time, that the confession she once struggled to contain had already served its purpose. It revealed her. It clarified you. And then it became irrelevant. She may have expected tension. Or fallout. Or reaction. But what followed was silence. Not avoidance, but completion. You did not circle back. You did not seek acknowledgement. You did not attempt to recalibrate connection. You moved forward. And forward motion leaves little room for reflection. This is where many misunderstand strength. They assume it announces itself, demands recognition, seeks vindication. But real authority does none of these things. It stabilizes. It simplifies. It removes excess. You became simpler. Your language sharpened. Your boundaries clarified. Your tolerance narrowed, not from bitterness, but from precision. And that precision reshaped everything. People around you adjusted instinctively. Some leaned in with respect. Some stepped back without explanation. Some faded quietly. You didn't chase any of them. You didn't need to. Because when alignment is correct, sorting happens naturally. She understood now that even if she spoke again, apologized, explained, reframed, it would change nothing. Timing had already decided relevance. And relevance, once past, does not return through effort. This realization was sobering. Not because she feared you, but because she recognized inevitability. Your path was no longer forming. It was underway. And the difference between formation and execution is finality. You no longer needed to process what happened. You no longer revisited conversations. You no longer measured reactions. What once felt unresolved now felt complete, not because it was addressed, but because it no longer mattered. This is the quiet outcome few talk about. Growth does not always end in closure. Sometimes it ends in indifference. Not the careless kind, but the clean kind. You were not hardened. You were clarified. And clarity does not linger. She sees this now. The way your attention is reserved. The way your time is protected. The way your decisions do not pause for consensus. And she understands that whatever access she once assumed has expired. not revoked. Expired. Because access that is not renewed through alignment ends naturally. You may feel this as lightness, as focus, as the absence of internal noise. You are no longer bracing for impact, no longer anticipating reaction, no longer rehearsing explanation. You are simply moving. This is the true result of the confession, not exposure, not conflict, not resolution, but release. Release from misinterpretation. Release from expectation. Release from the need to be seen correctly. You don't need to be understood anymore. You need to be precise. And you are. Her confession changed everything instantly, but not in the way she expected. It didn't bind you. It freed you. It didn't define you. It clarified you. And now, it belongs to the past. What comes next is not influenced by who doubted, who watched, or who realized too late. It is shaped by consistency, direction, and restraint, the things you cultivated quietly while others were forming opinions. This is where your attention belongs now. Not behind you. Not beside you. Ahead. Because what you are stepping into does not revisit old dynamics. It establishes new standards. And once those standards are set, everything aligns, or falls away, without effort. That is the final shift. And when you look back someday, you will not remember the confession itself. You will remember the moment it stopped mattering. That is how you'll know you moved forward exactly when you were ready.